So here is our group members, and I am Nur Faatihah binti Ahmad Redzuan as the first presenter. For the background, the OSH classification, labeling and safety datasheet of the hazardous chemical, known as the Class Regulation 2013, has been gazetted on 11 October 2013 and take effect on the 12th October 2013. It was enacted under provisions of a paragraph 16.6.2a, C, K and U of the OSHA 1994 and as to regulate the supply of the hazardous chemical for use at the workplace. Class Regulation 2013 versus CPR Regulation 1997. The OSH Classification, Packaging and Labeling of the Hazardous Chemicals, Regulation 1997, known as the CPR Regulation, were replaced by the Class Regulation. The CPR regulation were gazetted for the purpose of the chemical classification and hazard communication and previously used as a mechanism to control the supply of the hazardous chemicals to the workplace. However, CPR regulation are not address information about chemical suppliers, not define the scope of principal and subsidiary suppliers, and also do not address specific hazards. Even though both the CPR regulation and class regulation were drafted with the same intention, which is to provide a legal provision to ensure that the chemicals supplied or used in any place of work will be classified accordingly, and with proper hazard communication to ensure the safety and health of the workers. However, there are some significant differences that should be highlighted to ensure better understanding and compliance. So, the main objective of the class regulation is to ensure suppliers of the hazardous chemicals provide sufficient information on the hazards of the chemicals that they are supplied, so as to mitigate the risk of the accidents happening in the workplace, thus providing a safe and healthy working environment and condition. Next, we go to the application. So first, class regulation should apply to the chemical supply for use at a place of work. In this regulation, chemical means that a substance which is a chemical element and its compounds in a natural state or obtained by any manufacturing process, and chemical mixtures is a mixture or a solution composed of two or more substances which do not react. Second is exemption, which is the class regulation does not apply to. First, defined as a radioactive material under the Atomic Energy Licensing Act 1984. Second, defined as the pesticide under the Pesticide Act. And the third, listed as a poisons in the Poison Disorder 1993, except for chemicals which are classified therein as industrial and laboratory poisons, and so on. Next, the regulation also does not apply to the transportation of the hazardous chemicals by rail, road, inland waterway, sea or air, and hazardous chemicals in transit which are stored at a bonded warehouse. So as you guys see in this slide, the hazardous chemical consists two parts of the Schedule 1, which is Part A and Part B.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Muhammad Aidid bin Nur Ariffin. So I will proceed with the next slide, which is the responsibilities of suppliers. Here we have 5 main responsibilities of suppliers, which include to classify chemicals as hazardous chemicals, to ensure that a hazardous chemical is supplied in a packaging which satisfies a requirement by OSHA. Next is to label every packaging of a hazardous chemical with the right information, to prepare a safety data sheet or SDS for each hazardous chemical supplied, and lastly to prepare an inventory chemicals consisting of information on each hazardous chemical supplied. So in this slide, we have a diagram showing each of the main responsibilities that should be carried by suppliers, including the manufacturer and importer. So who are the suppliers? Supplier is the person who supplies a hazardous chemicals. So there are two types of suppliers. First is the principal supplier who formulates, manufactures, imports, recycles or reformulates a hazardous chemical. Second is a subsidiary supplier. This is the supplier who repack, distribute or retail hazardous chemicals. On to the next slide, we will proceed with the regulation, which is Regulation 4, Duty of Principal Supplier to Classify Chemicals as Hazardous Chemicals. In this regulation, it will be focusing on two parts of Industry Code of Practice, or also known as ICOP class. So the first part, which is Part 1 ICOP class, consists of classified chemicals which will be updated from time to time. In addition, if there are any inconsistencies in the classification, the Director General may determine the classification and labeling elements for that particular chemical. As for Part 2 ICOP class, this part describes the method of classifying chemicals according to their physical, health and environmental hazards. This part contains the criteria for classifying chemicals and decision logics for each hazard classes. So next is the classification of hazardous chemicals. But first, we need to know different types of hazard available. Basically, we have three types of hazard. First is the physical hazard, which is based on the intrinsic properties of the chemical. Second is a health hazard, which include chemical, physical or biological factors in our environment that can bring negative impacts to our health. And lastly is an environmental hazard. This hazard consists of extreme events or substances in Earth and its ecological system that might be harmful to humans. So before we see the list of classification of the hazardous chemicals, first we need to know what is a hazard category. So basically, each hazard class contains at least one category, where each category is assigned with a number, for example 1, 2, and so on. Categories may also be called as types, which are assigned with alphabet such as A, B, and so on. So each of these categories tells about how hazardous or the severity of a product, where category 1 is always the greatest level of hazard. If the category is then further divided, category 1A is a greater hazard than category 1B, while category 2 within the same hazard class is more hazardous than category 3, and so on. So on this slide is the table of the hazard category for each hazard class for all three types of hazards. So next, we will be moving on to the fifth regulation, which is the records of classification. In this regulation, we will be focusing on the duty of principal supplier. The main duties of principal supplier include to record the classification of chemicals as hazardous chemicals made under Regulation 4. Next is to make the record of the classification of chemicals as hazardous chemicals available for inspection by an officer, and lastly to follow the format of record as in the part 2 of the ICOP class.
My name is Nur Aliah Aqilah Rahmat, and I will continue presenting the next regulation, which is Regulation 6, Packaging Requirement of Hazardous Chemical. Specifically, it is a duty of supplier to ensure packaging of hazardous chemical by design and constructed that its content cannot escape. Packaging and fastening are strong and able to retain its content. Packaging and fastening materials are not susceptible to adverse attack by the content or form harmful or dangerous compound with its content. If fitted replaceable fastening device, the packaging can be repeatedly fastened without the content escaping. However, a supplier who contravenes this regulation be liable to a fine not exceeding 10,000 ringgit or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 1 year or to both, while in the case of continuing offence, to a fine not exceeding 1,000 ringgit. Next is Regulation 7, Seal of Package. A supplier shall ensure that every packaging of hazardous chemical is initially closed with a seal in such a way that once the packaging is opened, the seal is broken and cannot be repaired. A supplier who contravenes this regulation be liable to a fine not exceeding 10,000 ringgit or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 1 year or to both, while in the case of continuing offence, to a fine not exceeding 1,000 ringgit. Regulation 8 is a duty to label packaging of hazardous chemical. According to Sub-Regulation 812, which is labeling, it is a responsibility of principal and subsidiary supplier. Their duty to ensure every packaging of hazardous chemical is labeled legibly and heavily with product identifier, supplier identification, signal word, hazard statement and pictogram, and precautionary statement. If the container is less than 125 ml, supplier may label with product identifier, supplier identification, signal word, hazard pictogram, and read SDS before use. Sub-Regulation 8324-527 consists information in accordance with hazard classification, hazard pictogram, signal word, and hazard statement as specified in first schedule. Sub-Regulation 81 and 82 shall be in accordance with Part 3 of the ICOP. Information is supplied in national language and English language. If the signal word danger is used, the signal word warning must not be used. If classified within several hazard classes, all hazard statements should appear on the label unless there is evidence of duplication or redundancy. Where applicable, combined hazard statement specified in third schedule shall be used. Labels should be updated within 3 months if there is any changes resulting in a more severe classification. A supplier who contravenes sub-regulation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 commits an offence and shall, on conviction, be liable to a fine not exceeding 10,000 ringgit or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 1 year or to both. While in the case of continuing offence, a fine not exceeding 1,000 ringgit for every day or part of the day during which the offence continues after conviction. Regulation 10, Rules of Precedence for hazard pictograms and hazard statements on label describe the pictograms that should be used according to the type of hazard as shown in the figure. Regulation 11 is the dimension of label on every packaging of a hazardous chemical under Regulation 8 shall be as specified in the fourth schedule as shown in figure.
Assalamualaikum, my name is Muhammad Syahiir. Regulation 12, Affixing and tagging of label. The manufacturer must follow this regulation before distribution. First, the condition of the label on packaging. The manufacturer must affix the label horizontally when packing in the normal position. This is because it will facilitate the user and can pay enough good attention if the packaging has harmful chemical. When the condition of the container is bad, such as a rough or hard surface, use tagging and paste on the container. The reason is that the tagging is easy to use, to paste and remove it, and the tag also has no space problem. When the container less than or equal to 125 ml, Regulation 12 is reasonable to apply. Regulation 13, Safety Data Sheet. Sub-Regulation 13, Number 1. Safety Data Sheet to Chemical Recipient. This regulation is responsible to a duty of supplier. They need to update SDS with each hazardous chemical supply and any mixture containing hazardous substance at the concentration exceed cut-off value specified in 5th schedule. What is 5th schedule? SDS has 16 sections and each section has a different information. 5th section or 5th schedule is firefighting measure list. Recommendation for fighting of fire caused by the chemical include suitable extinguishing technique, equipment and chemical hazard from fire. Sub-Regulation 13, Number 2. Safety Data Sheet contain 16 must-have lists in the SDS has been listed from number 1 until 16. All of which are listed are very important because they contain chemical information, safety measure, and other information that user need to know. Sub-Regulation 13, Number 3 until 5. SDS language and the need to revise. The information in SDS must be same and accordance with a minimum requirement of SDS as well as mentioned in the Part 3 of ICOP. ICOP is Industry Code of Practice. Part 3 of ICOP is Hazard Communication, Labeling and Safety Data Sheet SDS, which is give a guideline on the preparation of the label and SDS in order to achieve compliance with Part 5 and Part 4 of the regulations. When SDS need to revise? Usually, when something happen like a new information on hazardous chemical or a fire has passed since the last date of preparation of a revision or directed by officer. Regulation 14, Inventory of Hazardous Chemical. Duty to prepare and submit inventory. Importer and manufacturer has responsible toward this Regulation 14. They need to prepare an inventory of hazardous chemical imported or supplied for quantity 1 metric ton and above per year and each calendar year. All the preparation must be submit an inventory to DG not late than 31 March of following year. Regulation 15. Confidential business information on hazardous chemical. Sub-Regulation 15, number 1 until number 2. CBI is confidential business information. CBI only limited to the name of hazardous chemical and composition and ingredient of hazardous chemical. CBI protect the information with the process that allows certain information such as chemical identity of one or more the trade secret hazardous ingredient to not be disclosed on safety data sheet SDS and the label for hazardous product. The information can be omitted and replaced with generic name. Sub-Regulation 15, number 3 until 5. Disclosure of CBI. The information can be disclosed to 3 types of people, which are DG, Director General, PhD Occupational Health Doctor, and the people who use or handle hazardous chemical. They can use to fully their need, such as finish the task.
Lastly, for the penalty, fine not exceeding 10,000 ringgit or imprisonment term not exceeding 1 year of both. And for continued offence, fine not exceeding 1,000 ringgit per day of a part of the day during continuing offence after conviction. That's all from us. Thank you.